He died. The galaxy grieved. But 6 weeks later, he woke up no longer just human. They called it a miracle. Others called it a mistake. But no one could explain how a dead man returned from the heart of a forbidden experiment, rewired, reformed, and carrying something older than war in his bloodstream. The Earth Alliance buried his file. The Zovari scientists tried to lock it away. But now, Elias Ward stands alive, beside the woman who broke every law to keep him that way. And as the stars prepare to fall, every species must ask the same question. What happens when the weapon they created learns how to love? Because this time, evolution didn't choose a soldier. It chose a bond. And the enemy felt it. Keep watching. The next transmission changes everything. They told the world he died in the surge. They even showed the funeral logs. But 3 months later, under the fractured sky of a forgotten moon, he was found half buried in the ash of a destroyed lab, breathing, barely conscious, and not entirely human. Captain Elias Ward's body was discovered near the smoldering wreckage of Black Site Theta 9, the classified facility that vanished in a cosmic incident no one dared speak about. His armor, melted to his skin, still pulsed faintly with residual energy no scanner could identify. And beneath that scorched plating, something new was growing. It wasn't the rain or the blood that startled Dr. Kaelen. It was the reading. The Zovari scientists stared at the handheld scanner, its holographic display blinking red and gold with spiraling symbols. It wasn't in Earth standard. It wasn't in any Zovari dialect either. Her system defaulted to one phrase: unclassified anomaly, evolutional leap in progress. Kaelen's breath caught, fingers trembling slightly, as she stepped closer to the body she had once pronounced dead. Not theoretically, officially, personally. She'd sealed the report herself. There had been no question, no heartbeat, no neural function, no response. But now the corpse was warm. Now the patterns beneath his skin moved like liquid circuitry, glowing dimly beneath layers of flesh that shimmered with an unnatural luminescence. His vitals, if you could still call them, that were elevated beyond any known species in the database. Heart rate erratic but stable. Core temperature climbing. It wasn't human anymore. Not entirely. Kaelen reached down, brushing her gloved hand against the side of his neck. His skin radiated heat, and her biosuit flared at the contact its interface systems, attempting and failing to interpret the signal. "Elias," she whispered, but it wasn't a call, it was a confession. Because somewhere beneath the sterile discipline of her scientific role, she had cared more than she ever admitted, more than their protocols allowed. He was supposed to be gone. She had grieved for him in silence, hidden behind reports and post-mortem files. But now the universe had changed the rules, and it had sent him back. His eyelids twitched. A moment later, his eyes opened, not searching, not confused, focused. Deep green irises, fractured by gold, like starlight breaking through a cracked lens. His voice, when it came, was raw and gravel-laced, as if dragged from another dimension. "Where am I?" Kaelen staggered back, scanner falling to her side. He was awake. He was talking. He was wrong. And then he said it, voice low, barely audible under the crackle of distant thunder. "They know I escaped." Kaelen's mind spun. Who was they? What had Black Site Theta 9 been hiding? What kind of force could not only rebuild a man atom by atom, but leave behind a living signal, a hybrid of flesh and frequency? She activated the emergency beacon, her fingers shaking. "This is Dr. Kaelen, Priority 1 medical event. Subject Elias Ward confirmed alive. Immediate containment and level 9 quarantine required." The comms crackled, but she hardly heard the response. Her gaze remained fixed on him, on the veins glowing under his skin, on the slow but deliberate breath he drew as if relearning how to be alive. What lay before her was no longer just a man. It was a message. And the universe had just started speaking through him. There are things buried beneath government archives that were never meant to be uncovered, not because they're dangerous, but because they're true. Kaelen didn't sleep that night. She sat alone in the dim glow of the outpost's archive terminal, her face lit by the flickering pulse of decrypted logs. Her fingers moved with a precision born of desperation, bypassing encryption layers she wasn't cleared to touch. digging deeper into Elias's recovered service file, but what she found wasn't a file. It was a fracture. The date of his death didn't align. The timestamp of his last biometric ping-off by 17 minutes. She cross-referenced the station logs, security footage, quantum telemetry, and there it was. A silent entry. No attached name, no command override. Just one word embedded in the access string, Kaelus. Director Dorian Kaelus, a name she hadn't seen in years. The ghost at the edge of every classified corridor. The man who built the Earth Zovari Joint Black Program sand then vanished from public oversight 5 cycles ago. She exhaled, her breath catching on fear. Not fear of failure, of knowing. The logs revealed a hidden project, Operation Aegis Echo. On paper, it was listed as non-viable, abandoned during preclinical testing. In truth, it never stopped. Deep within Site 7, Kaelus had approved full trials in sentient subjects. Human. Zovari, volunteers, they claimed. But buried beneath the language of consent were signatures forged, records falsified, deaths listed as training casualties. The program's focus? Neural lattice expansion, consciousness migration, genome destabilization for interface bonding. And Elias was the prime candidate. She opened the video log. The screen trembled with static before resolving into cold, sterile light. A surgical chamber. Elias strapped to an upright frame, shirtless, skin pale, eyes wide not with fear, but understanding. He wasn't struggling. He was speaking. You said this would help us survive what's coming. I trusted you, Kaelus. And off-screen, that voice. Calm, calculated, almost tender. You'll be the first, Elias, not the last. What you become will lead us. A sharp hiss, then light floods the screen as an energy anomaly is activated, a swirling sphere of distorted physics, tethered to a crystalline core pulsing in rhythm with Elias's heartbeat. The light swallows him. The feed ends. Kaelen's hands shook, not from horror, from rage. She remembered the memorial, the folded flag, the words spoken with practiced grief by the very command that had signed him off as expendable. Elias Ward hadn't died. He'd been handed over, chosen or sacrificed. A door slid open behind her. She spun, expecting security, but found herself staring into eyes she hadn't seen in over a decade. High Counselor Rel Varel, her father. You were never supposed to see that, he said softly. You knew? Her voice was a blade. He looked older than she remembered. The lines in his skin had deepened, but the guilt was fresh. I approved the cooperation with Kaelus. I thought we were protecting our people. I didn't know, he trailed off, then met her gaze. I didn't know he'd use your partner. Kaelen's heart cracked. He wasn't my partner, she whispered, though the words tasted like lies. He was more. He was everything I couldn't admit in time. Rel stepped forward, placing something on the table. A data crystal. A single fragment. There's more, he said. Not all of it survived the crash. But this shows what Elias became after the anomaly. You should see it for yourself. Kaelen didn't look at her father again. She turned back to the console, inserted the drive, and loaded the footage. This time, Elias was standing, bare-chested, his skin marked by shimmering fractal lines, organic circuitry glowing with soft, golden light. His voice was calm but different, as though more than one version of him were speaking in harmony. I know you're watching this, he said. Kaelen, if it's you, then I'm sorry. I wasn't strong enough to stop them, but something happened inside the energy. It rewrote me. I remember death. I remember being scattered across time. But I came back because something is coming. And I'm not the end of the experiment. I'm the beginning. Kaelen closed her eyes. The man she knew gone. The being now in her care-evolved. But through the pain, something else began to take root. Not fear. Resolve. Because whatever Director Kaelus had done, wherever Elias had gone, he came back. And he came back warning them. Outside the observation bay, lightning struck the ridge. A low hum filled the walls. And somewhere, deep in the restricted chambers beneath Site 7, something old had begun to pulse again. Not alive, not dead. There are conversations that don't echo in rooms. but in memory etched, not in sound, but in silence, in the way two people look at each other when everything familiar has shifted under their feet. Kaelen sat across from Elias in the shadow-lit med bay, the hum of containment fields surrounding them like a ghost. His body was still recovering, at least on the surface. But the man inside, she wasn't sure he'd ever stop changing. His eyes, once just green, now carried depth that wasn't human. They shimmered faintly when the lights caught them wrong. Or maybe, too right. He stared at the floor as if it held answers. The energy wasn't random, he said finally. It was a signal, a pulse, searching for something to connect to. Not a person, a mind. His voice didn't tremble, but hers did, inside. What did it show you? He didn't look at her, just leaned back slowly, closing his eyes like he needed to steady what was coming. Worlds, emptied. Civilizations hollowed out like fruit left too long in the sun. Entire species reduced to memory. A pause. Then his hand lifted slightly, fingers twitching unconsciously, as if sketching shapes no longer visible. And behind it all, something worse than death. A presence, not malevolent, not kind, just hungry. She swallowed, her voice suddenly small. The Nullborn. He nodded once, not like a man confirming a theory, but like a soldier recognizing a battlefield. They consume potential, not just life, but future. They leave behind planets that never had a chance to evolve, because they never will. Kaelen stood slowly, pacing, her boots whispering against the steel floor. But that's legend, Zovari myth. My grandmother told stories about the Void Eaters, the beings that silence stars. They're real, he interrupted softly, and worse, they're close. She turned sharply. Then why did the architects, the shapers, create the energy anomaly? Why give you power? Why let you come back? He looked at her now, direct, heavy. 1,000 unspoken truths in the way he said nothing for just a moment too long. Because Earth was an experiment, one of many. They call them evolutional traps. Environments seeded with just enough hardship, just enough chaos to produce something useful. Useful how? Weapons, he said, almost whispering. Adaptable, emotional, unpredictable weapons. That's what humanity is. That's what I became. The silence that followed wasn't silence, it was recognition. Kaelen crossed her arms, not from defiance, but defense. You think you're not human anymore. I know I'm not completely. She stepped closer, her breath shallow. But you still remember my name. He blinked at her, and something in his posture softened. Of course I do. She stared at him, and for a heartbeat, neither was scientist nor soldier. Just two people who had lost too much, standing on the edge of a truth too big to carry alone. Tell me about Kaelus, she said finally. Elias looked away. He never worked for the Alliance. Not really. He was always theirs. One of the first Earthside operatives the Shapers cultivated back when they thought they could guide humanity gently. And when gentle didn't work, they chose pressure, conflict, wars, loss. They sculpted us through pain, and when that wasn't fast enough, they intervened. He raised his arm, exposing the glowing neural lattice dancing beneath his skin. This is them and me, and whatever comes next. Kaelen sat beside him. Her hand, ungloved, reached out not to scan, not to test, just to touch. What do you feel when it pulses like that? Everything, he said. The thoughts of machines, the frequency of stars. I can see where events converge, where choices narrow, and every time I look forward, I see war. With the Nullborn? No, he whispered. With ourselves. The real danger isn't what's coming. It's what we're willing to become to survive it. The med bay dimmed as the ship rotated toward the far side of the moon, and for a moment only their breathing filled the space. Then we need to decide who we are, Kaelen said, before they decide it for us. Elias looked down at her hand resting on his. Her touch had always been clinical. This wasn't, you still believe in humanity? I believe in you. And beneath her skin, she could feel the pulse of the Shaper's code, answering. But it wasn't alien anymore. It was his. And now, hers too. The air between them had changed, not in temperature, not in pressure, but in weight. Like something ancient had stirred, pressing down, whispering truths neither of them were ready to speak. Kaelen stood at the edge of the med chamber, arms crossed not from cold, but from discipline fraying at the seams. Across the room, Elias sat on the edge of the diagnostic table, the sterile white light tracing the golden lattice beneath his skin patterns that pulsed faintly, almost as if they breathed. He wasn't looking at her, not quite. His gaze stayed fixed on a point just past her shoulder, as though afraid that if he met her eyes, something inside him might break, or worse, reveal itself. Her voice was softer than she'd meant it to be. "You're stabilizing." He didn't move. "For now," he said, "but the changes are accelerating again. I can feel it, in my blood, my bones, my thoughts." He paused, then looked up. "I'm not just remembering things anymore, Kaelen. I'm seeing things that haven't happened yet." Her throat tightened. "Visions?" He nodded slowly. "You, me. A corridor filled with starlight and blood, something reaching through me to speak, with your voice." The silence between them hummed, charged, and unfinished. She crossed the room before she could think better of it, boots whispering over metal. Her biosuit shifted with each step, the faint blue bioluminescence along her collarbones reacting to proximity. He watched her now, really watched, his eyes wide, but no longer afraid. Kaelen reached out. "Let me see," she said. Her fingers touched his chest bare, burning warm, alive with motion. The moment they made contact, her biosuit shimmered, then bloomed with light. Not just illumination, connection. Threads of energy bridged between her readings, syncing to his biopatterns. The chamber lights flickered. His voice caught. "Kaelen, don't speak." She stepped closer. The glowing lines beneath his skin shifted, blooming like starlight, blooming beneath flesh. They moved with her breath, her pulse, as if his body had recalibrated itself to match hers. The glow wasn't just biological, it was responsive, intelligent, intimate. "You're not just human anymore," she whispered. He exhaled slowly. "And you're not just Zovari anymore." His hand found her wrist, not to stop her, but to steady her. His grip was firm, but not controlling, a grounding point in a storm they couldn't name. "I can feel you," he murmured, "even when you're not touching me." Kaelen's mind fought to keep the moment clinical, intellectual, something she could define, study, isolate, but her skin betrayed her. The warmth, the pull, the way her thoughts blurred at the edges. "How long have you known?" she asked, breath trembling. "Since before the anomaly. Since the first time you said my name like it hurt." She closed her eyes. His words were heat and gravity. "We're not supposed to." "I died," he cut in gently. "There is no protocol for what comes next." She opened her eyes. Her fingers traced one of the golden lines along his collarbone. It flared at her touch, not painfully reverently, like it remembered her. Every instinct told her to step back, but her soul leaned in. "This isn't rational," she whispered. "It's real." She kissed him. It wasn't planned, it wasn't gentle, it was inevitable. The moment their lips met, the lattice beneath Elias's skin flared with blinding light. The room responded, monitors spiking, systems chiming, but neither of them moved to stop it. They were no longer two halves in separate roles, no longer doctor and subject. They were one system now, interlocked, interfaced. When they finally parted, both breathless, her forehead rested against his. "You know this changes everything," she said. "I'm counting on it." Her hand stayed on his chest, his heartbeat steady under her palm. For the first time in hours, the lattice stopped pulsing. It glowed. Still. Silent. Whole. And Kaelen realized it wasn't just his body adapting anymore. It was his soul. And it was reaching for hers. It began with a whisper. Not a voice. Not language. But structure. Patterns humming through the shattered frequencies of the abandoned Shaper interface, buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten code. Where human minds saw chaos, Elias saw symmetry. Like a melody just out of reach until suddenly it wasn't. His eyes flickered open mid-diagnostic. Kaelen had only just turned her back when every console in the lab lit up at once. Interfaces long dormant shivered to life, reacting not to a command, but to proximity. To him, not hands, not touch, thought. "Elias?" Her voice cut through the flickering light. He didn't respond. Not at first. His body sat still, but his consciousness had gone somewhere else beyond the room, beyond the outpost. The golden fractals beneath his skin pulsed in time with the foreign circuitry. Symbols moved across the holoscreens, none from Earth, none from Zovari systems. Yet his pupils tracked each line with eerie precision. Synaptic throughput is accelerating, Kaelen murmured, scanning his vitals. Neural mapping's off the charts. He's not just thinking faster, he's seeing more. Elias finally blinked, slowly, like returning from orbit. They're alive, he said. The systems, the shaper tech. It's not passive, it's listening. To what? He turned to her, voice steady but low. Me. Before she could process that, a new signal broke through the secure channel. Static at first, then, a voice she hadn't heard in over a decade. This is Director Kalis. Initiate phase transition. Deploy ascendant units to forward location Theta. No containment. Bring the subject back alive or partial. Kaelen's heart turned cold. She cross-checked the trajectory. The transmission was local. Kalis was on approach. And he wasn't alone. She looked at Elias. His face was unreadable, but the light under his skin intensified. They're not just soldiers, she said. They're attempts, he answered. They tried to replicate what the anomaly did to me, but they forced it, rushed the process. It shattered them. Kaelen brought up surveillance feeds. The transport signatures confirmed it Kalis's ship descending through the upper atmosphere, surrounded by smaller craft. Hostile. Fast. Not Alliance-coded. You called them Ascendants? He nodded once. The Shaper's failures. Half-human minds wrapped around alien muscle. Too unstable to control. Too valuable to destroy. Kalis thinks he can use them to finish what he started. And if they take you? They won't just take me, he said quietly. They'll take everything I've become. My memories, my blueprint. They'll use it to make more. Not to defend, to conquer. She stepped closer. How do we stop them? His gaze didn't waver. We don't run. We think them. She stared at him out the lattice of light beneath his skin, now dancing in reaction to his rising adrenaline. Every breath he took recalibrated something. Every heartbeat ran like a processor. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a new kind of interface. But when he looked at her, he still looked human. Still full of unspoken things. Pain, love, warnings. I need access to the Shaper Core, he said. Their tech buried beneath Site 7. It's not just data, it's alive. And it knows how to defend itself. I think it's been waiting for someone who could speak its language. Kaelen hesitated. And if you go in too deep? He smiled, faintly. Then you pull me back. You've done it once. The signal from Kalis's ship cut across all bands unlocked, aggressive, mocking. Elias, I know you can hear this. You're not unique. You're just first. Kaelen's eyes met his. Let's make sure I stay that way, he whispered. And with that, he stepped toward the ancient terminal, reached out his hand, no gloves, no shield, and let the past speak to the future through him. The interface accepted him without resistance. The room dimmed, and the war began, not with a weapon, but with a thought. The storm began without warning, no sound, no flame, just motion, sudden and violent, boots over steel, alarms screaming in 3 languages. Ascendant units breaching the outer sector, their twisted limbs moving like shattered geometry, given muscle and rage. And in the eye of it all, 2 fugitives with nothing left but truth and each other. Kaelen dragged the last of her emergency kits toward the docking passage, her breath sharp, pain blooming with every step. Her side had taken a sharp piece of reinforced alloy in the corridor ambush. She hadn't told Elias. He already had too much weight on his shoulders, and his body was changing again. He didn't walk anymore. He moved, the way light bends, the way currents flow. Each time she blinked, he looked more like someone the Shapers dreamed than someone she remembered. The research vessel loomed ahead, its hull scorched but functional. Old Zovari tech, semi-automated. Not fast, but hidden. Quiet, like them. She stumbled. Elias caught her before her knees hit the ground. Your vitals are crashing, he said too calmly, scanning her with no device, just his eyes. I'm fine, she lied through blood-soaked teeth. His hand pressed to her wound. Heat surged between theme-electric, primal. The lattice beneath his skin reacted instantly, blooming with blinding gold. She gasped as the light crawled across her skin, through her suit, into the broken tissue beneath. "You're burning me," she whispered, eyes wide. "I'm healing you," he replied. "I think." "You think?" I didn't know I could. The pain was replaced by a strange clarity. Her skin sealed, the bleeding stopped, and for a moment, she forgot the war, forgot the betrayal, forgot the way the universe was unraveling. "You gave me part of yourself," she said softly. "I've been giving it since I came back." But there was no time for warmth. The ascendants were coming. She could feel it like gravity shifting, like rage taking shape. Broken minds in perfect bodies, moving on orders they didn't understand from a man who no longer cared what they destroyed. The airlock hissed open. They boarded the vessel. Kaelen limped to the cockpit while Elias moved toward the relay interface obelisk of alien alloy embedded in the wall, dormant until his hand met it. The system screamed to life. He didn't touch controls. He was the control. "What are you doing?" Kaelen asked, settling into the pilot's chair, trying to stabilize launch vectors. "Sending everything." His voice was distant, layered. Too many thoughts at once. His skin now glowed from within like starlight, pushed through veins. Coordinates, evidence, biometric logs, Kaelus's betrayal. "I'm injecting it into the relay, all of it, on a 40 light-year burst." Kaelen's hands froze. "That'll expose you to every listening post, every military AI, every sensor." "I know. And it'll drain you," she said, turning to him, her throat tight. His body arched as the relay core drew from him like a conduit. He gritted his teeth as the alien language of code flowed through his veins and into the grid. The lights dimmed. Then pulse. Not visual, not audible, but felt. A shudder across space itself. In that moment, the truth screamed louder than any fleet. Transmission complete. Elias collapsed. Kaelen ran to him, his eyes fluttered, skin pale, light dimming beneath his surface. "You idiot," she whispered, cradling his head. "You burned everything for them. For us." His lips barely moved. "Not for them," he whispered. "For you." She brushed hair from his face, trembling. "I didn't ask you to." "You didn't have to." He slipped into unconsciousness. Outside the hull, distant flashes of movement signaled the Ascendant's confusion. The data burst had hit them, two-code unraveling command chains, overriding loyalty patterns. They screamed into the void, lost in broken instructions. Kaelen turned back to the nav screen. The ship trembled. She locked their course toward the edge of Alliance-controlled space. As stars stretched into streaks, in the silence of faster than light took hold, Kaelen pressed her forehead to Elias's. "You came back from death," she whispered. "Don't leave me now." And in the stillness, his skin glowed once more barely. Faint, but still alive. There are choices that carve their names into the soul. Choices that don't ask for permission. They simply arrive heavy, final, and unforgiving. The stars outside the viewport looked distorted, smeared like brushstrokes across the dark. Two fleets converged in the distance Earth and Zovari. Coordinated interception, unified targeting. Something that had never happened before and might never happen again. But inside the vessel, silence. Elias lay motionless on the floor beside the relay core. His skin, once glowing with soft amber patterns, now dimmed to a pale, pulseless sheen. The energy he'd burned to transmit the truth had taken more than just strength. It had unraveled him at the seams. His human cells were fragmenting. The shaper lattice was unstable. No species could survive in two forms at Onsenote for long. Kaelen knelt beside him, the medical interface scanning without solution. Alarms chimed in, growing desperation. Red warnings cascading across her visor. Degeneration, synaptic collapse, structural disintegration. He wasn't dying. He was unbecoming. Her hands hovered, unsure what part of him was still safe to touch. The ship AI prompted one last option. Unauthorized, untested, prohibited under every Zovari medical regulation. Neural genome stabilization via direct bioweave, a permanent merge. Her DNA, woven into his. It would save him, and it would change her. Her hand trembled above the console. There were moments in her life when clarity struck like a blade. This wasn't one of them. This was fog, fire, and love laced with fear. She looked at Elias what remained of him and saw not just the man she once studied, once admired. She saw the one thing she never said aloud. She saw home. "I didn't want to lose you again," she whispered, her voice breaking as she initiated the sequence. "Even if it means losing what I was." The injection device emerged from the console, a silver arc of nanite tubing curling toward her wrist. She didn't hesitate. The needle found her vein, and she watched her own DNA twisted into a new map flow into the system, glowing violet with hybrid markers. The lattice in Elias's body surged in response. The lights returned faint, flickering. His chest rose. Once. Twice. Then his eyes opened. But they weren't just his anymore. They were theirs. He blinked slowly, as if waking from the edge of a dream he'd refused to leave. "Kaelen, what did you do?" She didn't answer with words. She let him feel it. Her pulse echoed in his chest. Her breath synced with his. She was part of him now, not metaphor, not sentiment. Molecularly, spiritually. Her fingers brushed his cheek, warm again. "We were never meant to survive this alone," she said. Outside, the fleets danced with tension, waiting for the next move. Inside, two souls had already made theirs. 6 weeks is nothing on the scale of galactic history, but for two people, it had been enough to become something the galaxy had never seen before. The chamber was no longer sterile. Not like the beginning when everything smelled like steel and secrets, when every gesture was guarded and every glance carried unspoken rules. Now, the walls were etched with flowing script in 2 languages, Earth Standard and Zovari calligraphy, representing a new doctrine, not of dominance, not of submission, but of defense built from truth. Kaelen stood at the helm of the Joint Defense Initiative coalition no one believed would ever form. Earth's admirals and Zovari high scientists all gathered in a single orbiting station, not because they trusted one another, but because the universe had finally given them a reason to. And that reason stood beside her. Elias no longer wore a uniform. Uniforms were for tools, for protocol. He wore no armor, because there was no more illusion of invincibility. Only responsibility. Only awareness. The glow beneath his skin remained, but it had quieted, stabilized, no longer pulsing in pain or resistance. It shimmered now steady, subtle, and alive. He was no longer a human artifact. He was something made of choice. And Kaelen, her blood now, part of that same system, was no longer purely Zovari. Her readings no longer matched any known sequence, but she felt no fear in that. Because in the place where biology ended, something else had begun, something deeper. The scientists watched them like living myth, whispered in corners, debated in classified sessions. Were they anomaly or prophecy? Neither of them cared. Outside the reinforced observation glass, fleets moved Earth carriers, Zovari spire ships, patrol vessels bearing a new crest, an eclipse split by a pulse of starlight. The symbol of what now stood between the galaxy and the thing stirring beyond it. Kaelen's voice cut through the quiet as she watched the distant ships reposition. "They still don't trust us," she said. "Not completely." "They don't have to," Elias replied. "They just have to believe we exist." She glanced at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. Exist is an understatement. They stood in silence for a moment longer, the hum of the station wrapping around them like a lullaby of vigilance. He finally turned to her. "They wanted me to be a weapon," he said. Her brows lifted. "And?" "They forgot one thing." She looked up at him, already knowing, but still wanting to hear it. "What's that?" He didn't hesitate. "Weapons don't love. People do." His hand found hers, fingertips brushing the pulse in her wrist that now beat in tandem with his. And when they kissed this time, it wasn't born of desperation, or fear, or the need to feel alive. It was calm, steady, chosen. The kind of kiss that binds timelines. Above them, the stars shimmered like watching eyes. But neither Elias nor Kaelen looked away. They weren't hiding anymore. And far beyond the known sectors, in a place where light bends and sound dies, something ancient stirred. The Nullborn. It had felt the ripple. It had tasted the broadcast. And for the first time in 1,000 silent years, it adjusted course. Not because it feared what had awakened, but because for the first time, it wasn't sure how to consume it. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. He was meant to be their weapon silent, obedient, and disposable. But what the architects never predicted was her. Together, they rewrote the blueprint, not with violence, with connection. He didn't just survive evolution. He chose who he became. And she didn't just save his life. She merged hers with it. Now the galaxy watches, divided between fear and awe. And far beyond the stars, something ancient has awakened, because the truth wasn't in the data. It was in their bond. And what comes next isn't a war. It's a reckoning. Subscribe to @Alien Chronicles Us. Because this was never just a story. It was the first warning. And the next episode, it's already written in the stars. Don't miss what they're hiding. We'll show you.